It was standing at the fence line when I finally admitted what it was. Not what I'd told myself for 7 years. Not the story it built to keep my hands from shaking every morning when I walked out to the barn. The real thing, the actual truth of what I'd raised on this land, fed with my own hands, watched grow from something small enough to carry against my chest into something that could knock a full-grown man flat without meaning to. The snow was hard that February morning. It crunched under my boots like broken glass. The sun hadn't cleared the tree line yet, and the world was gray and cold and very still. I remember the smell of the air, iron and pine, and something underneath both of those, something older. The fence line runs along the eastern edge of my property, where the field drops off into the tree belt. It is maybe 400 feet from the barn door. I was carrying a bucket of water because the trough had frozen overnight. My breath was coming out in clouds. I set the bucket down in the snow because my right knee was barking at me the way it always does in cold weather. That knee has been bad since a logging accident in 1991. It tells me things before my eyes catch up sometimes. I looked up, and it was just standing there. Not at the fence. Past the fence. 30 feet into the trees. It was watching me the way it always watched me. Still and patient and fully present in a way most living things never are. 7 feet tall now, maybe a little more. The dark fur had gone thick for winter, the way it did every year round November, and its shoulders were broad enough that the birch trees on either side of it looked like saplings by comparison. Its eyes caught the gray morning light and held it. I had a name for it. I'd used that name every single day for 7 years. You'll get to that. What I want you to understand first is the weight of the moment. Because I'd looked at it 1,000 times. Fed it, cleaned it, sat beside it in the dark on nights when the wind came off Lake Michigan hard enough to rattle the barn walls. And every one of those 1,000 times I had kept a particular story running in my head. A story about what it was, what category of living thing it belonged to. Because a man needs categories. A man alone on 40 acres needs the world to make a certain kind of sense, or he starts to come apart at the seams. That February morning, the story stopped working. Because standing at the tree line, 100 yards behind it, barely visible between the trunks, was something else. Something larger, something that had not come from my barn. I am going to tell you how it started. I owe you that much. I owe somebody that much, and there is no one left on this earth I can tell it to directly. So I am telling you. I am sitting here in this cold room with the window, dark, and the land outside quiet, and I am going to lay it out from the beginning. Every year of it. Every morning, and every bad decision and every moment I told myself it was fine when the honest part of me knew it wasn't. My name is Dale Kowalski. I know that because my neighbor Bert Halsey used to holler it across the fence line when he wanted to complain about my fence posts or borrow my tractor or argue about the township road. Dale Kowalski, you got a minute? He said it like both words were one word. I haven't heard him say it in 2 years. I haven't seen Bert in 2 years. That is part of what I'm telling you about. I have lived on this property since I was 34 years old. My wife Karen and I bought it together in 1997. We had plans. We had a list of things we were going to build and grow and make. Karen left in 2009. Not because of the creature. It hadn't come yet. She left because of me, because of the man I had become after the logging accident and the 2 years of mill work that followed and the slow, grinding way that kind of life takes something out of you that doesn't come back easy. I don't blame her. I said that at the time, and I mean it more now. She knew something was missing in me before I did. After she left, I was alone on 40 acres with a barn, a truck with a bad alternator, and a wood stove that needed new gaskets every other winter. I kept the land going, raised a small beef herd for a while, cut cordwood, did some fencing work for neighbors when my knee allowed it. I was not a happy man. I was not an unhappy one either. I was a man in a holding pattern, waiting for something without knowing what I was waiting for. It came in the spring of 2016. April. The ice had been off the creek for 3 weeks. The ground was soft, and the mud season was at its worst, and the tree line along the eastern belt was showing the first thin green of new leaves. I was out checking the creek bank on the morning of April 14th. I remember the date because it was 2 days before what would have been my 19th wedding anniversary, and that number always landed on me a certain way in spring. I heard it before I saw it. A sound in the brush on the far bank, high and rough. Not quite a cry, not quite a bark. Something between the two, something that did not fit inside any category I had a name for. I stood still. In the woods, you learn to stand still first and move second. That reflex has kept me upright more times than I can count. It came out of the brush low to the ground, moving on all fours, but in a way that was wrong. The proportions were wrong. The legs were too long in the wrong places. The head was large and dark-furred and broad across the muzzle. The ears were tall and set high. It was maybe 18 inches at the shoulder, maybe 20. It crossed the creek at a shallow spot, moving clumsily, slipping once on a wet rock and catching itself with a front limb that flexed in a way a dog's limb doesn't flex. It stopped in the mud at the bank and looked at me. I should have walked away. Every sensible bone in a 63-year-old man's body should have turned him around and sent him back to the house. I know that. I am not telling you this story to make myself look wise. It made the sound again, rough and high, and then it sat down in the mud and looked at me with these amber eyes and did nothing threatening. It was thin, badly thin. The fur was patchy and dull the way fur gets when something hasn't eaten right. There were burrs matted into the scruff along its neck. It had a cut above its left eye that had dried dark. I stood there for a long time. Then I went back to the house and got the bucket I used for feeding the old barn cats. I don't know what I put in that bucket, scraps, whatever was near. I brought it back to the creek bank and I set it down 10 feet from where it was sitting. I walked back 20 feet and watched. It took a long time, 15 minutes maybe, but it came to the bucket. That was the first morning, that was how it started. With a bucket on a muddy creek bank in April, and an 18-inch creature eating whatever scraps he'd scraped together, and me standing there in my work boots telling myself it was probably just some odd-looking dog that had come off the state land. I told myself that for about 4 days. By day 5, I had built a lean-to shelter against the south side of the barn. Nothing complicated. 4 posts, a roof of corrugated tin, a bed of straw inside. I had run a length of heavy chain from a ring bolt in the barn wall to a collar E'd fashioned from a piece of nylon strap. I told myself the chain was temporary. Something to keep it safe while I figured out what it was and who it might belong to. I checked the county lost and found listings. I drove to the feed store in Brockton and asked old Pete Murch, who knew every animal within 40 miles, if he'd heard of anyone losing an unusual dog. And Pete looked at me a certain way and said no. The chain lasted 11 days. On the 12th morning, I went out to the lean-to at 6, and it was sitting up in the straw waiting for me. It had pulled the chain out of the ring bolt sometime in the night. Not broken it. Pulled the bolt itself clean out of the barn wood, which was 2-inch rough-cut pine that had been in place for 60 years. The chain was lying coiled in the straw beside it, neat as if someone had set it down carefully. It was sitting there watching me. Not fled, Not gone, just sitting. I unhooked the collar from its neck and put the chain in the barn, and never tried to confine it again. That was the day I named it. I named it after my father's old dog, and a big brown shepherd mix named Hector that my father had kept chained in the yard and that I had always thought deserved better. The name felt right. It felt like making a small amendment for something old and unfinished. I called it Hector. I was 56 years old that April. My right knee was bad, my lower back was starting to give me trouble in damp weather, and I had not had a conversation longer than 10 minutes with another human being in the better part of 3 months. I want you to understand the condition I was in when this thing arrived on my land. I want you to understand the particular kind of loneliness that lives in a man who has been alone long enough that he has stopped noticing he's alone. It becomes the atmosphere, it becomes the air you breathe, and you stop knowing what it would feel like to breathe something else. Hector was not a dog. I knew that by the end of May. I think I knew it on the 12th morning when it had pulled that bolt out of the wall and sat there waiting for me. But I kept the working theory of dog alive in my mind for another 6 weeks because I needed something to stand on. By June, it was standing upright more often than not walking upright, not yet, but standing. It would rise on its hind legs to look over the fence rail, or to reach the shelf along the barn wall where I kept the grain, and when it stood that way, it was already 4 feet tall, and the proportions of the thing were undeniable. The arms were too long. The hands, and I will use that word because no other word is accurate, the hands had 4 fingers and a thumb, and the grip on them was extraordinary. I watched it one evening in late June, pick up a rusted bolt Eid dropped in the barn aisle, examine it, and set it back down on the exact shelf where it had been, with care, with intention. That was the evening I sat down on the barn floor with my back against the wall and did not move for a long time. Hector came and sat beside me. Its shoulder was against my shoulder. It smelled of hay and creek mud and something underneath those, something musky and dark and wild, like the smell inside a hollow tree. We sat there until the bats started coming out over the field and the first stars showed above the barn roof. I remember thinking, very clearly, that this was the most company I had felt in years. I did not examine that thought. I let it sit. The object between us was a flat gray stone. I know that sounds like nothing. Let me explain it properly, because it matters to the rest of what I'm going to tell you. There is a stretch of the creek bed, about 40 yards from the east fence where the water runs over a shelf of smooth, flat shale. I used to sit on that shelf when I was troubled. Not for any reason I could have explained. I had sat there after Karen left. I had sat there on the bad nights after the logging accident when the pain was enough to keep a man awake and mean. The stone was about the size of a dinner plate, dark gray with a pale vein of quartz running across it in a slight curve. I had carried it back from the creek some years before and kept it on the barn windowsill. No purpose, just habit. In early June of 2016, I noticed Hector carrying it. Not throwing it, not rolling it, carrying it in both hands, the way you'd carry something fragile, moving from the barn to the lean-to shelter and setting it down. Then, later, carrying it back. I watched this happen 3 times without saying anything. The 4th time I went to the lean-to and sat down near it and held out my hand. Hector set the stone in my palm. We passed it back and forth for maybe 20 minutes that evening. No reason, no game I could name, just the passing, the giving and receiving of the thing. When it got dark, I set the stone on the window ledge beside the lean-to door, and Hector went inside to sleep. That stone became the language between us when there was no other language. The summer of 2016 was hot and dry. The creek dropped by late July and the mud cracked at the edges, and the fields went brown faster than usual. Hector grew through that summer like something under pressure. By August, it was 5 feet standing. By September, it was nearly 6. I was feeding it twice a day. A mix of raw meat from the chest freezer, grain, whatever vegetables I had from the garden, and whatever it found on its own in the tree belt, which was considerable. I didn't ask about that last part. I noticed the evidence. The bones at the edge of the tree line. The way the deer population on my 40 acres changed. I didn't ask. My knee forced me off the tractor that August for 2 weeks. I was bad enough that I couldn't grip the clutch without the pain going up into my hip. I was in the house more than the barn, and on one of those bad days Hector appeared at the back door. Not scratching or demanding, just standing there looking through the screen. I let it in. It stayed for 3 hours. Sat on the kitchen floor with its back against the refrigerator and watched me ice my knee. Before it left, it picked up the gray stone from the windowsill, which he'd moved inside at some point without thinking about it, and held it for a moment. Then set it back. September of 2016, Bert Halsey came over to return a post hole digger and caught a glimpse of Hector crossing the far end of the yard toward the barn. Bert stopped in the driveway and stood very still for a moment. Then he said, "Dale Kowalski. What in the holy hell is that thing?" I told him it was a dog he'd taken in, a big breed mix. Some kind of wolf dog. Bert looked at me for a long time. He said, "That ain't any dog I've ever seen." I said it was. We stood there. Bert took his post hole digger and got in his truck and drove back to his property. He did not come over for social reasons after that. He'd stop at the fence line sometimes in his truck and look toward my barn. I'd wave. He'd drive on. I don't hold that against him either. The first winter was the hardest in terms of learning. Not hard in the way of fear or danger. Hector was never threatening toward me in any way I could name from those first months onward. Hard in the way of understanding. A man alone with something outside his categories has to build new categories or he loses his footing. I spent that winter watching and adjusting. By December, Hector was 6.5 feet tall and moving upright most of the time. The gait was not human. The hips and the knees carried a different kind of angle, and the upper body shifted with each step in a way that was fluid and unnerving at the same time. The fur was thickening for winter now, the way a wild animal's does. Darker around the shoulders and the back of the neck. I kept the lean-to as well insulated as I could. Extra straw, a horse blanket I nailed to the inside of the walls to break the wind. Hector tolerated all of this with patience. Christmas night of 2016, I was in the barn mending a broken fence rail by lantern light. I had the radio on, a country station out of Traverse City, though the signal was bad and kept fading. Hector was in the lean-to. I could hear it moving in the straw. And then it came through the barn door and stood near the lantern. It looked at the radio the way it looked at most things, with that total attention, that quality of being fully present in the moment. The music came through clear for a few seconds. Some old song I can't name now. Hector made a sound. Not words. Something low in the chest. A vibration more than a sound. I am not going to tell you it was singing. I am not going to tell you what it was. I am going to tell you it made the hair on the back of my neck rise, and my eyes get hot in a way I couldn't explain. I kept mending the fence rail. After a while, Hector went back to the lean-to. The year 2017 moved differently than the year before. There is a thing that happens when you stop counting days and start just living them. The strangeness of Hector's presence stopped being the center of every morning and became instead just the condition of my mornings. I woke up. I made coffee. I went to the barn. Hector was there, or came in from the tree belt within an hour, and the day began. My knee was better in the dry weather. I got some fencing work in the spring and used the money to fix the truck's alternator and buy a chest freezer so I could keep more meat on hand. March of 2017, there was a late blizzard. 2 days of hard snow and a third of heavy drifting wind. The lean-to held but barely. On the second night, I heard the tin roof on the lean-to start to give, and I went out in the dark with a flashlight and a coat had thrown over my long underwear and found Hector standing in the yard in the blowing snow, looking at the collapsed section of the roof. Calm. Assessing it. Not distressed. I stood beside it for a moment and we both looked at the damage, and the cold was extraordinary, the kind that gets in through every layer. And I said out loud to myself or to Hector, I'm not sure which, "Come inside then." Hector slept in the kitchen that night, on the floor near the wood stove. I woke up at 3 in the morning and came downstairs for water, and it was lying there on its side with its eyes half open, watching the fire through the stove's small glass panel. Its breath moved slow and even. The fur on its flank rose and fell. The gray stone was on the kitchen floor beside its head. I don't remember putting it there. I don't think I did. I went back to bed. The lean-to was repaired by the end of March, but after that, Hector came inside during bad weather. Once or twice a month in the spring. More in the fall. I stopped feeling strange about it. I stopped feeling strange about most of it. The summer of 2017 brought a new problem. Not Hector. Hector was not a problem. The problem was people. A family 2 miles up the county road. The Prodders. They had kids, school-age boys who rode bikes on the road and went into the state land on the weekends. One of those boys, the older one, maybe 12, had been in the tree belt behind my east fence. I knew because I found boot prints in the mud near the creek crossing. Small, narrow, tennis shoe tread. Nothing happened. Whatever the boy had seen or not seen, nothing came of it that summer. But I moved the areas where Hector ranged during the daylight hours. I started making sure it was in the barn or the lean-to by late afternoon. I started being careful. That summer, I also noticed Hector watching the tree line at night. Not just watching. Watching in a specific way. There is a difference between an animal looking into the dark because it hears something, and an animal looking into the dark because it knows something is there. I didn't understand the difference yet. I thought it was prey. Deer moving in the timber. I thought that for a long time. August of 2017, I drove into Brockton for supplies. I was in the hardware store and ran into Pete Murch, who worked the counter there on Tuesdays. Pete said there had been some unusual reports from the state land. Campers finding large prints in soft ground. A deer camp off the South Unit Trail that had found a tree stand bent double, like something had gripped the base and twisted it. Pete laughed when he told me. He said some people were saying they'd seen something large, dark, moving through the timber at the edge of the Prodder boys' property line. Pete said the boy claimed it was 7 feet tall. Pete thought it was an entertaining story. I bought my hardware and drove home. I did not ask Hector about it. I want to be honest about that. I knew what those prints were, I knew what had bent that tree stand, and I said nothing and did nothing because I had already, by August of 2017, made a decision that I understood, on some level, was the worst decision I had made in my adult life. I had decided to keep going, to keep it here, to not examine the size of what I was protecting. A man can make that decision without knowing he's made it. That is what I want you to understand about the years that followed. 2018 began cold and stayed cold through April. The woodpile was low by February, and I was cutting timber from the back of the property, the section nearest the tree belt. Hard work for a man with a bad knee and a back that was now giving me regular trouble. Hector followed me to the timber section one morning without being invited, stood watching me work the chainsaw for a time, then, without any signal from me, began dragging the cut sections to the stack by the barn. I want to be exact about this. It was dragging 8-foot sections of 16-inch hardwood that I would have needed my tractor to move. Dragging them with one hand, moving at a pace that made my work feel slow and small beside it. We worked like that for 3 days. By the end of the 3rd day, the woodpile was full, and we were both tired. That evening, I sat on the porch steps, and Hector sat beside me on the ground. I had the gray stone in my coat pocket. He'd taken to keeping it there when I went to the timber section, a habit I couldn't have explained. I took it out and held it in my palm. Hector looked at it, put one of its large dark hands over mine and held it there for a moment without pressure. Just held it. Then took the stone gently, turned it once and gave it back. I did not say anything. The sun went down behind the timber. The spring of 2018, I found the first clear print on my property, not in the tree belt, on my land in the soft ground near the creek, larger than Hector's prints, significantly larger. I crouched over it for a long time. Hector was not with me. I measured the print with my hand. My hand is a large hand. The width of that print was half again the width of Hector's. The depth of it in wet mud was deep, heavy, much heavier than Hector. I looked at the creek. I looked at the tree line on the far bank. I covered the print with dead brush and went back to the barn. That summer Hector was different. Not dangerous, not volatile, but different. Distracted in a way it had never been before. More time at the east fence line in the evenings. More time watching the timber. The watching I had noticed before, but this was longer, more focused, and sometimes accompanied by that low sound in the chest. The vibration. Not singing, not language, just presence. Communication in a register I couldn't access. I noticed it eating less in July. Not nothing, but less. And moving differently, the way an animal moves when it is paying attention to something larger than its immediate surroundings. By September of 2018, I had found 6 more prints on my property, all in the soft ground near the creek, all larger than Hector's, spaced with a stride I tried not to calculate. I calculated it anyway. The stride was long. I should have made a decision that fall. I know that. I know it with a clarity that I did not have in the moment. Looking back from where I am sitting now in this cold room, at 63 years old, I can see the shape of what was coming the way you can see a bad storm on the horizon if you're willing to look at it straight. I was not willing to look at it straight. I kept feeding Hector. I kept keeping the gray stone in my coat pocket. I kept waking up in the morning and walking to the barn and starting the day the only way I knew how to start it. The winter of 2018 and 2019 was the last quiet winter. I want to render that properly because it was also, I think, the last time I was something resembling content. I don't want to use a bigger word than that. Content. A man on his land with a fire going and a chest freezer full, and a creature he'd raised from something smaller than a retriever puppy sitting in his kitchen watching the wood stove. January of 2019 was cold and still. The kind of cold that makes the whole world quiet. Sound travels differently in that kind of cold. Far off, you can hear things you can't hear in other seasons. Tree limbs cracking in the frost a quarter-mile away. The creek still running below the ice. And at night, on the clearest night, something else. I heard it the first time on January 9th. I am certain of the date because I had driven to Brockton that day and bought a new pair of work boots. The first new boots I'd bought in 4 years. and I was sitting on the kitchen floor lacing them when I heard it through the back window. Low, distant, a sound like nothing I had a name for. Not a coyote, not a wolf, though I'd heard wolves on the state land before. Something lower and more deliberate, and with a depth to it that seemed to come up through the floorboards as much as through the air. I looked at Hector. Hector was at the kitchen window, standing, fully upright, both hands flat against the glass, looking out at the dark. It did not move for a long time. I sat on the kitchen floor in my new boots and did not move either. By February of 2019, I was sleeping badly, waking at 2 or 3 in the morning with the specific alertness of a man who has heard something and not yet admitted to himself that he heard it. Getting up, going to the kitchen window, looking out at the yard and the barn and the dark edge of the tree belt beyond. Nothing there, nothing visible. But the snow along the east fence line was disturbed in ways that took me a long time to look at directly. The stride, the print size, the depth. Something was coming close to the fence line at night and stopping there. Hector knew. Whatever Hector knew about it, Hector had known longer than me. I understood that in February of 2019, and I filed it away in the part of my mind where I kept all the things I was not examining. March of that year, Hector stopped going into the tree belt alone. For 3 years, it had ranged freely through the timber on both sides of the creek. Whatever it did in there I did not track and did not ask about. But in March of 2019 it stopped going. It stayed within sight of the barn. It stayed within sight of me. If I walked to the east fence, it came with me. If I went to the tree line to check something, it stayed at my shoulder, not in front, not scouting ahead the way it would have done before. At my shoulder, beside me, as if it was placing itself between me and something I couldn't see. I noticed that too. I told myself it was a change in season, a change in ranging pattern. Animals change patterns. I told myself that. The summer of 2019 was the last full summer. I want to be deliberate about recording it. Not because it was peaceful, it wasn't, not fully, but because I remember it in a different quality of light than the years before or after, the way some things only become clearly visible when you know they're ending. June of 2019, I was repairing the east fence, a section of post and wire that had heaved in the spring thaw. I was working alone, Hector sitting on a rock near the creek watching. It was a warm morning, clear, smelling of new grass and mud, and the mineral smell of creek water. I had the gray stone in my shirt pocket. Habit. I'd moved it from my coat to my shirt when the weather warmed. I was setting a post when my back went, and I went down on one knee with a sound that wasn't polite. Hector was beside me before I had both hands on the fence wire. Not touching me, close, that quality of proximity that isn't intrusion. It present the way a person is present in a room without doing anything. I said, out loud, to nobody in particular, "I'm getting old, Hector." My voice was rougher than I expected. I hadn't heard my own voice in 3 days. Hector made the low sound, the chest vibration. Once. Then it picked up the fence post I'd been setting and drove it into the ground with a single downward force that set it 8 inches deeper than I could have managed with a post driver. I finished the fence. By August of 2019, the sounds at night were regular, not every night, 2 or 3 times a week. Always after midnight. Always from the direction of the east tree belt. And they were closer, not by a lot, but measurably closer each time. I had a specific reference point. There is a big red maple at the edge of the tree belt, 50 yards from the east fence, and I had started using it as a landmark. The sounds, when I located their direction in the dark, came from the far side of that maple in June. By August, they came from its near side. I should tell you about one specific night. August 14th, 2019. I woke at 2 in the morning. The kitchen was dark and the house was cold despite the summer heat because I'd fallen asleep without closing the back window. I got up and went to close it. In the yard, by the east fence, Hector was standing. 7 feet tall, fully upright, arms at its sides, facing the timber. The moon was 3/4 full and high, and it lit the yard well enough. I could see the set of Hector's shoulders. I could see the way its head was tilted forward, not raised in aggression, but lowered. Almost bowed, and from the timber, very close to the red maple, there was a shape. I am going to tell you what I saw, and I am going to ask you to believe me or not as you choose. The shape was large, larger than Hector. The fur was darker. In the moonlight it appeared almost black. It was upright, fully upright, and it was still. They stood like that for a long time. The shape in the trees and Hector at the fence. I stood at the kitchen window and did not breathe. The shape in the trees made the sound, the low one, the deep one, up through the floorboards, up through the foundation of the house. Hector made the sound back. Once. Then the shape moved. Back into the timber. Not running, walking. Slow and certain and deliberate. And Hector turned from the fence and walked back to the lean-to and went inside. I stood at the kitchen window until the sky started to go gray. I knew what had happened. I have always known what happened on that August night. The shape in the trees had not come to threaten or to take. It had come to look, to assess, to see what its own had become. And what its own had become was living on a man's farm, eating from a bucket, sleeping in a lean-to, carrying a flat gray stone back and forth in the manner of a kept thing. I understood what it saw. I did not change anything. Fall of 2019 came hard and early. The leaves were down by mid-October. The cold settled in and stayed. I noticed Hector was heavier than usual, not sick-heavy, not slow, dense, the way an animal gets when it is reaching full size. It was 7 feet and a few inches now when it stood straight. Its hands, when it picked something up, made my hands look like a child's hands beside it. November of 2019. I drove to Brockton on a Thursday and stopped at the feed store, and Pete Murch told me without me asking that there had been more reports. Not just on the state land now, along the creek drainage, south and east of my property. Large prints in soft ground. A trail camera on the Halsey property, Bert's place, had captured something at the edge of his east woodlot. Bert had shown the image to Pete. Pete described it as big, dark, bipedal. Pete used the word he'd been using in that amused tone for 3 years. Bigfoot. He said it like a joke. He watched my face while he said it. I bought my feed and drove home. I told Hector that night, not in words. I don't know why I felt the need to speak about it. I was sitting in the barn, and it was sitting near the door, and I said out loud, "People are seeing things. We have to be more careful." I don't know what I expected. Hector looked at me for a long time. Then it looked at the gray stone on the barn windowsill. I picked it up and held it. Hector made the chest sound once, low and brief, and went into the lean-to. I held the stone until my hand was warm from it. The winter of 2019 and 2020 was the last winter of what I would call the normal period. I want to be honest about what normal had come to mean. It meant a man of 59 years old on 40 acres in rural Michigan, bad knee, bad back, no income to speak of, no family nearby, no friends with any real access to his life. It meant a 7-foot creature that had grown from something found on a creek bank, sleeping in a lean-to 30 feet from his house. It meant a flat gray stone passed between a man and something outside his categories as a form of daily language. It meant sounds in the night from the east timber that he had stopped trying not to hear. That was normal. I was not crazy, I want to say that plainly. I was lonely and stubborn and not willing to give up something that had become the central weight of my days. But I was not delusional. I knew what Hector was. I had known it with my whole honest mind since the autumn of 2017, when Id crouched over that first large print in the creek mud. I knew what was in the tree belt. I knew what had been standing on the far side of the east fence on that August night in 2019. I kept going. Spring of 2020. The world outside was loud with news I paid no attention to. I had a generator, a satellite dish for limited internet, and enough food storage to go 3 or 4 months without a trip to Brockton if I needed to. The outside world did not reach me much. I was cutting timber again in late March, and Hector was with me, dragging sections the way it had in 2018, and on the second day of cutting I stepped wrong on a tree root and my bad knee buckled entirely, and I went down in the snow and I could not get up. I want to tell you about that moment carefully. I was on my back in the snow in the timber on the back 40. My knee was not just barking, it was wrong. At the kind of wrong that tells you something has given way for the last time. The cold was coming up through my coat from the ground, and the trees were bare above me, and the sky was the particular flat white of a Michigan sky waiting to snow. I had no phone. I had left the house without my phone, as I always did, because the signal was so poor out there it was useless anyway. I said, out loud, I can't get up. I said it to the air, to nobody. Hector crouched beside me. I felt the warmth of it before I saw it move, that animal warmth that is different from human warmth, denser somehow, more reliable. It put its arms under me, one under my back and one under my knees, and it stood up, carrying me, the way a person carries a child. I am not a small man. I am not a thin man. I weighed then what I weigh now, about 210 pounds. Hector carried me out of the timber and across the field and to the back door of the house without any visible effort. It set me down on the kitchen floor. I looked up at it from the kitchen floor and I said, "Thank you, Hector." And Hector looked at me with those amber eyes. And then it went to the kitchen windowsill and picked up the gray stone and put it on the floor beside me. Not in my hand, beside me. And then it went out the back door and across the yard to the lean-to. I did not move from the kitchen floor for a long time. I was laid up for 6 weeks with that knee. Not immobile, but close. Hector brought things from the barn. I did not ask it to, and I cannot explain how it knew what to bring, but twice during those 6 weeks it arrived at the back door with things I needed. A length of rope I'd been trying to reach from the barn wall. A tool I'd left out in the lean-to and thought I'd have to go without. I healed slowly. I was 60 years old by the time I was fully weight-bearing again. Late summer of 2020. I moved differently. I had a cane for a few months. Hector watched me use it with attention but not concern. Something in its expression had changed that year, and I could not name what it was for a long time. Later, I named it. It was knowing. The kind of knowing that comes before a thing that cannot be stopped. The sounds from the timber were every night by autumn of 2020. Not just from the east belt, from the south tree line too, from 2 directions. I tried not to map this. I mapped it anyway, the way you do things you tell yourself you're not doing. The sounds from the east were the original one. The sounds from the south were different. Higher. A different register. A different individual. 2. There were 2 of them out there now. I told no one. I kept going. February of 2021. Bert Halsey came to my fence line in his truck and left it running, and walked to where I was clearing snow from the east fence gate. He was 68 or so, Bert. A thick man with a gray beard, and the look of someone who has made up his mind to say something difficult. He said, "Dale Kowalski, I'm going to ask you something plain." I said, "Fine." He said, "Is there something on your property that's been on my property?" I said I had a large dog. He said, "That ain't a dog, and we both know it." I said nothing. He said, "I've lived here 30 years, and I never had trouble. And now I've got trail camera images I can't show to anyone without sounding like a damn fool, and my cows are spooked every night along the east fence." He looked at me. He said, "Whatever it is, I need it to not come onto my property." I said I would keep it confined to my land. Bert looked at me for a long time. He said, "You know what you're doing out here, Dale. Not mean, genuinely. The way a man asks another man a question he actually wants answered." I said I thought I did. Bert nodded. He got in his truck and drove to his house, and I stood at the fence in the cold for a while. I kept it confined, as much as I could. I reinforced the east fence in March. It was not Hector I was trying to contain with the fence, and we both knew it. I was trying to draw a line, a perimeter, an edge of the territory I was willing to be responsible for. Hector understood. I think it understood better than I did what the fence meant and what it couldn't mean. Summer of 2021 was dry again. The creek dropped. In dry years, the creek bed is crossable on foot at several points without removing your boots. I found crossing prints in August, east bank to west bank, not Hector's, the large ones, single passage. Something had come across and then gone back. I filled in the prints and reinforced the bank with brush. Fall of 2021, I noticed Hector was restless in a new way. It had been attentive before, alert, watchful. This was different. Pacing along the east fence in the evenings. Standing at the fence with its face toward the timber for long stretches. Sometimes making the chest sound continuously for 10 or 15 minutes. Very low, almost below hearing, felt more than heard. I knew it was communication. I had known it was communication for 3 years by then. I kept knowing it and kept not acting on the knowledge. October of 2021, I sat with Hector on the barn floor on a cold, clear evening. The door was open and we could see the stars above the field. The gray stone was in my hand. I'd carried it everywhere by then, coat pocket or shirt pocket or set on whatever surface was nearest. 5 years of that. I turned it over and the pale quartz vein caught the light. I thought about my father's yard, the old brown shepherd mix that deserved better. I thought about Karen listing off the things she'd needed that I hadn't known how to give. I thought about the logging accident and the 2 years after it, and the slow, quiet way my life had narrowed down to this. 40 acres, a barn, a lean-to, a thing I had raised and loved and refused to let go of. I said out loud to Hector, "I know. I don't know exactly what I meant. I think I meant all of it." Hector reached over and put its hand on my hand, the hand over mine, the stone between my palms, just for a moment. Then it lifted its hand away. The winter of 2021 and 2022 was when things began to end. Not dramatically, not all at once. Slowly. The way a loaded structure fails slowly and then all at once. December of 2021, something tore the east fence. Not broke, tore. 40 feet of post and wire pulled down in the night. The posts had been driven 3 feet deep. They came out of the frozen ground the way a man pulls a nail from soft wood. I found it in the morning, standing in the field looking at it in the cold, my breath coming in clouds, not able to think for a moment about what kind of force was required to do that. I rebuilt the fence. It was torn again in January. I rebuilt it again. Hector watched me rebuild it both times. It did not help. It stood at the edge of what I was doing and watched with that expression I had been calling knowing for 2 years now. It did not touch the fence or the materials. It just watched. I rebuilt it a third time in February, and it held through the spring. In March of 2022, I drove to the county seat and stood in the hallway of the county building for 20 minutes trying to decide whether to go into the office of the county sheriff. I don't know what I was going to say. I don't know what outcome I thought was possible. I stood in that hallway for 20 minutes and then I drove home. April of 2022. Bert Halsey sold his property. I didn't know until I saw the real estate sign from my driveway. I drove over. Bert was loading boxes into a pickup truck in his yard. He looked at me when I pulled in and he said, without me asking, "I'm going to my daughter's place in Indiana." He said, "I'm 69 years old and I'm done being afraid at night on my own property." He loaded 2 more boxes. He said, "I don't know what you got over there, Dale. I don't know what you think it is. But there's more than one of them now, and they're not afraid of a fence line." He drove away that afternoon. I stood in his empty driveway and watched the dust from his truck settle on the county road. That was the spring. The spring was the last quiet period. I came to full knowledge of what was coming in June of 2022. Not because of the fence, not because of the sounds, because of Hector. It had been changing through the winter and spring in ways I'd been noting and filing and not addressing. The ranging had increased again, despite my attempts at containment. It was going into the East Belt again, but differently than before. Not alone. I found paired prints once in May. Hector's stride and the large one, walking the same direction, parallel. Like a young thing and an older one moving together through timber. In June, I went to the barn one morning at 6 and Hector was not there. Not in the lean-to, not in the yard, not in the barn. I waited an hour. It came in from the East Belt at 7, moving fast. When it came through the lean-to door, its fur was carrying the smell of deep timber. Not just pine and mud, the older smell. The one I associated with the hollow tree, with something larger and wilder than